Our guest on the Russo Edge Podcast has a hot idea to help patients of serious blood cancers, and you'll find it in the deep freeze. Welcome, everyone, to the Russo Edge Podcast. Today's conversation is with Kevin Caldwell, the CEO and co-founder and president of Ossium Health in San Francisco. At Ossium, Kevin has created the world's first bank of life-saving, on-demand bone marrow stem cells for transplant. And that bone marrow is kept safely in the deep freeze until it's needed by patients who are waiting for a donor. Prior to that, Kevin spent years in technology and investments. And of course, he grew up on a small farm in Tennessee where he cared for his grandparents. And that's where he first saw the flaws in the healthcare system. Kevin, welcome to the program. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Solomon. Thank you for having me.
Well, obviously, it's great to have you. And let's go ahead and get started because let's talk about some of your younger days when you were growing up in Tennessee and what you witnessed with your grandparents. And it was what you saw there that set you on a path to make changes in the healthcare system. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I grew up in Middle Tennessee. My parents are both from Nashville, and that's where I lived during the school year and spent much of my time. During the summers, every long weekend, on the holidays, my parents would take me out to my grandparents' farm in West Tennessee, about 90 minutes outside of the city. I learned like everything I could about sort of living and working on the farm for my grandparents. And one of the consequences of spending so much time with my grandparents as a kid is that, by the time I was in high school, they were getting up in age and they spent more and more time in the healthcare system. And what I noticed is that first I would see them getting sick at home, and then we would take them to a doctor where they would get sort of retroactively diagnosed and given an intervention that usually did reduce their suffering, but didn't necessarily improve their health. And so I would ask, why can't we anticipate what's going to make them sick ahead of time? And why don't we have more interventions that actually restored their health rather than just treating their symptoms? And the answer that I got was, well, that's just not how healthcare works. Yeah. So I never really accepted that. And ultimately, the motivation to change that is part of what led to Ossium.
That's a very powerful story. Let's fast forward to the work that you've done in investments and consulting with McKinsey. How did that set the groundwork for the work that you're currently doing at Ossium?
So I joined McKinsey's healthcare team out here in San Francisco in 2014. And, most of our clients were the clients that I worked with anyway, were just sort of global sort of healthcare and biopharma companies. Yeah. And much of the IP, many of the new assets that global pharma companies get really comes from buying biotech startups. And so typically the pharma company would have a startup that it had already identified that was really interested in potentially acquiring, and they would essentially hire us to come in and evaluate the company and make a recommendation, buy it or not. We would only have a few weeks to do this because the pharma company would only have about a month to make a final decision. And so we would come in cold and, study a business, learn, go through its data, its clinical data, its preclinical data, talk to the investigators on its clinical trials, the management team, and value the business, and then make a recommendation, do it or not, within about 3 weeks. We typically would do 7 days a week, 16 hours a day during that period. I'd take a couple of days to sleep and then go do it again. And so I saw a lot of biotech companies and a lot of depth through that.
Yeah, and equate a really great learning experience for you as well. And you got some great work done. And I now understand that you hit some tremendous milestones. The first patients have had a successful bone marrow transplant using your platform at Ossium. It must be a really proud moment for you, your company, your employees, the patients, physicians, and the entire organ donor community. What more can you tell us about it?
That's right. So, at Ossium, we've built a platform for banking transplantable bone marrow from organ donor vertebral bodies. And so the same the same organ donors that provide hearts, kidneys, livers, lungs that we've relied upon for our solid organ transplant ecosystem for more than 60 years throughout the world. What we've developed is a process for getting sort of life-saving bone marrow stem cells from those very same donors. And so, there's an enormous sort of ecosystem involved in this. We work closely with the organ procurement organizations that sort of consent and donation from the families and that perform the recoveries. We've built our own facility in Indianapolis, so we process the bone marrow. Much of the underlying sort of science and IP behind our novel process was developed by my co-founder, Eric Woods. And it's something that the entire team is enormously proud of. And so we spent really 8 years developing the product, building out the platform, and doing animal studies to prove that you could get viable functional cells from organ donors. And then this year, we've done our first 3 patients already, and we're happy to say that we found sort of tremendous outcomes from those patients. And so the very first patient was a 68-year-old woman in Michigan. She had no donors available. She was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, and the team, her medical team, was running out of options. So we connected with them, and we identified a matching donor in our bank for her, and we were able to provide her with a bone marrow transplant.
Yeah.
And she's had a tremendously successful outcome. So full engraftment and has returned to normal life.
Wow. Kevin, that is very exciting. It's just phenomenal news. So tell me what's next for you guys at Ossium?
Well, we are, the current bone marrow transplant ecosystem, there's about 20,000 patients every year, mostly patients diagnosed with blood cancers who go looking for a bone marrow donor. And only just over half of those patients, just over 10,000, receive a bone marrow transplant. The other half of those patients often just become so weak while looking for a donor that they're no longer eligible for a transplant. There are also patients who could potentially benefit from a transplant with non-malignant disorders who don't even go looking for one because the process takes time. Our goal, at least over the next couple of years, is to dramatically increase the availability of bone marrow transplants and the outcomes that these patients can receive so that the vast majority of patients who need a transplant, need this life-saving procedure, can receive one. It's worth noting just how powerful bone marrow transplants are. So we often think about stem cell therapies as 21st century medicine, and for the most part, that's true. But a bone marrow transplant is a type of stem cell therapy that has 70 years of medical history behind it. And when we do these transplants, we permanently replace the blood and immune system of the recipient for that of the donor. For the rest of the recipient's life, they will produce blood and immune cells with genetics of another human being. In principle, you could treat many diseases of the blood and immune system with this procedure. It's incredibly powerful. And at Ossium, the goal is just to make it vastly more accessible to more people.
I think that's phenomenal. Obviously, the ability to share that and democratize it. So tell me, as you look forward to the future, how important is it to clearly communicate with everyone who's working within that ecosystem, from investors to doctors, the patient community, the organ donor community, and even biotech CEOs?
Right. As we treat more patients and generate more and more sort of promising data from these successful outcomes, the major task that we have transitions from just making the product and treating patients to communicating about it, so that because around the world, really, there are thousands of patients every year who don't know that the opportunity to get a bone marrow transplant from a source like Ossium exists. And they may have given up hope without knowing that about the innovations that we've made. And so one of our core goals over the years to come is just to make sure that there's broad sort of education about the quality of the results that we've generated and about the hope that it creates for these patients around the world.
Yeah. So what other maybe words of wisdom can you share with other biotech CEOs when it comes to the importance of communication internally, externally, with other companies, and even within your own ecosystem?
I would say just a few things. One is that there's a wealth of insight there's a wealth of innovations that are published in the medical literature each year that is never reviewed by sort of entrepreneurs who could potentially take those ideas and use them to build businesses that really have a dramatic impact on patients. And so if we look at the work that Ossium has done, there were bone marrow cell recoveries from deceased donors before Ossium existed. There were bone marrow transplants themselves, of course, date back many decades before we existed. But no one had ever built the ecosystem at scale necessary to be able to do these transplants, not just for one or two patients in sort of a proof of concept study, but for many thousands of patients every year. And so I'm going through and systematically asking yourself how you can, take the science and bring it to the world at scale, I think is sort of the fundamental sort of challenge and opportunity of the entrepreneur. And I would suggest that, and I think many of the barriers that people think are impossible, a lot of the obstacles that people initially said couldn't be overcome, like getting access to organ donors from around the United States, building a large and diverse bank, building a facility that could process and hold it all of these things can be done with grit and with time. And so it's been 8+ years, almost 9, building Ossium to date. And the fortitude of sort of sticking with it is the other thing that I would say is incredibly important.
Well, we want to say thank you to our guests and to our friend, Kevin Caldwell, CEO, co-founder and president of Ossium Health, for joining us on the Russo Edge podcast today. Thank you for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you for having me.